Has to work quickly. Down to 6 seconds. Carr going down again. And it's Quinn Williams this time for the Jets.
Over the middle in the air, picked off. Brian Poole to the end zone, touchdown. Hunter to beat, and the punter brings him down. Braden Mann saved a touchdown, most likely.
Looks right, fires a bomb down the right sideline again for Mims. What a catch by Denzel Mims.
And welcome back to an episode of the Cool Jets podcast. We're your hosts, Ben Blessington and Michael Nania. Today we're talking about the NFL free agency class of 2021. Michael, really quickly, your thoughts on this class, because we've been talking about the 2021 free agency for a while now, considering that Joe Douglas was not that aggressive in 2020. He saved up a lot of cap space. A lot of teams are going to have to let go of their veterans with the falling salary cap due to the COVID implications of last year's season. So it's an interesting class when you look at it from a glance, and it's a class that may continue to get even stronger as these teams have to cut down their rosters.
Yeah, this is a really interesting class because I think there are, at a lot of positions of need for the Jets, there are good solutions for particular things that they're looking for, areas that were weaknesses last year. That they could solve with a lot of really good free agents in this class. And they have the potential to be. We'll see what Joe Douglas wants to do, but they can be very big players in this class with their cap space in a season where the cap isn't going up as much as it has in other seasons. And a lot of teams could be cutting players to make sure they have room. So the Jets could be big players, and there are a lot of good solutions for big problems that they have.
Yeah, and especially after they cut guys like Henry Anderson and Alex Lewis and maybe even some other guys, they're going to have a lot of cap space to work with here. And you kind of alluded to Joe Douglas being aggressive. We don't really know a lot about Joe Douglas, and we kind of talked about this in our last podcast, that there is an assumption that he's not going to be aggressive in free agency and we build through the draft. And I think that is the case. But I wouldn't be surprised if he is more aggressive in free agency this offseason. It's a new coach, a new system. Defensively, you're going from a 3-4 to a 4-3, and that requires a lot of pieces. And then offensively, there's a lot of moving doors there, specifically in that offensive line, and we need to revamp the weapons for whoever the quarterback is. So there's a lot going on, and I could see Joe Douglas being aggressive. I think he will typically stay away from the big $20 million a year free agents. But I do think that he'll go for quantity over quality per se. But let's take a look at some positions that the Jets should address in free agency, and they probably will attack, and just talk about some of the best fits there, some of the guys they should avoid, and maybe some of the underrated second wave players that we think Joe Douglas will capitalize on. First, and we lump these all into one, the running backs, fullbacks, and tight ends, because we think it's I don't think the Jets are going to be too active there, or at least pay too much big money there, because, a position like a fullback, and I guess we'll just start there. The guy that immediately comes to everybody's mind is Kyle Juszczyk, because he just played such a huge role for the San Francisco 49ers. And obviously fullback is a dying position in the NFL. And even on our last podcast, somebody had commented that what the hell, the Jets don't need a fullback, but it's like in this offense, you 100% do. And Juszczyk is a unicorn. He's a special player. He's a guy that is essentially a 6 offensive lineman and a second tight end. I mean, you can throw to him, you can give him the ball, and he's an amazing blocker. So I would be very surprised if the Jets weren't in on Juszczyk, even if you have to pay him $5 or $6 million a year, because he's not just your typical fullback. But Mike, when you look at fullback, running back, and tight end, who are some of the best fits in your mind?
Well, first at fullback, I think Juszczyk is a really good target if he is interested in coming over, if they're interested in him and they can get him at a price that makes sense. He's just a flat out good player. You look at him block out in space in that offense, he's a dominant blocker, really, and he also contributes a lot in the passing game. He had 4 receiving touchdowns this past season, and he's been involved throughout his career. He's had at least 19 receptions in each of the last 7 seasons, and he's got 12 career receiving touchdowns, so he can contribute there as well. So he's a very good player. He's obviously as good as it gets, and there are a few other fullbacks that are frequently used in free agency. Jacob Johnson from the Patriots, Ferkser from the Titans, Michael Burton from the Saints. So there are a few other options if they do really want one. None of them are as good as Juszczyk, obviously. Although Ferkser did have 387 yards this past season, who's also kind of a tight end as well, but he can sort of fill that fullback role if you want him to. So there are some options if they want to go there. But then I think tight end is an interesting one because you have an interesting prospect in Chris Herndon, who obviously had a very bad, frankly, 2020 season, although he finished a little bit better, but disappointing by, pretty much everyone's standards. So you're pretty weak at that tight end position, but there are a lot bigger needs you have to address throughout the roster. So I don't think you're going to be putting a lot of assets into that position, but they can still get a lot better there. And you do need good blocking at that position in this offense. Really, in any offense, it's important, but especially in this one, if you watch that Niners team and how important George Kittle and Levine Toilolo and all their tight ends were in some of their best games running the ball, it's really important. So there are some good options in terms of guys who can block at tight end, but also give you enough receiving to be on the field for quite a bit. Trey Burton, Jonnu Smith, Gerald Everett, all three of those guys, I think, have a good blend of athleticism as receivers, but also blocking ability. So those are three tight ends who I think are pretty good targets who can block, but also have enough receiving talent to stay on the field.
Yeah, Trey Burton's a guy who's really interesting because he overlaps with Joe Douglas, and I think he's in the right price range for the type of tight end that the Jets are going to be willing to add, because I do think there's a belief in Chris Herndon in that building, and I don't think they want to throw out a lot of money to a guy like Jonnu Smith, who we really like, and we think he's a terrific player, but I don't think the Jets want to invest a lot in that tight end position, considering they have a prospect in Herndon who can maybe join the post-Gay success club. They just need a guy a veteran tight end number 2, can come in if Herndon misses more games and can spell Herndon if he continues his poor 2020 season. Michael, when you look at the running backs, who are some guys that interest you there? Because I do believe the Jets will add a running back in free agency. I don't believe that they're going to pay him a lot of money. So I think when you look at players to avoid, he's an amazing player and obviously has familiarity in a similar system. But like Aaron Jones, the guy that I do not think the Jets should or will pursue. But there's a number of those tier 2 guys in that running back position that I do think the Jets could look to add to bolster their young running back group that, right now consists of Ty Johnson, Josh Adams, and the Michael Pirine.
Yeah, Aaron Jones is really good, and he's legitimately good. He's good in the passing game, good blocker, pass catcher, all those things. So he's going to get a pretty big deal, and he deserves it. But the Jets just aren't in position to sign a running back to that much money. Way too many other needs at more important positions, because running back is one of the most dependent positions in the game, dependent on the blocking in front of them, the scheme to be successful. So it's just not a premium position. So, but there are a lot of good complementary pieces that I think make sense for them, especially guys who can contribute in the passing game. James White is out there. He's obviously one of the most prolific receiving backs. Rex Burkhead also, who's done some work with the Patriots alongside James White. And then you look back at some 49ers connections. Jerick McKinnon was finally healthy this past season, had a pretty good year in the passing game. Matt Breida didn't do too much in Miami, but he has plenty of speed and has that 49ers connection as well. Jamal Williams is probably my favorite player of this free agent class in terms of the running backs. He just brings so much to the table. He's one of the most well-rounded running backs in the league. He might not be a superstar rusher, but he's not bad at anything. He's a great pass blocker. He's never fumbled. He almost never drops the ball. Very good receiver all around. And he is still pretty good as a rusher, even if he's not, Derrick Henry. But he's a very good all-around player who you can have on the field on any down in any situation, and he's going to get the job done, execute the fundamentals of his position at a very good rate. To have a guy who can, who catches everything you throw at him, who doesn't give up pressure as a pass protector is really valuable. So I like Jamal Williams quite a bit as the best fit in terms of the running backs.
Yeah, I think Williams is a guy that is quite intriguing. And as we kind of alluded to, I do really think the Jets will add a running back here, just because I think their running back group needs veteran leadership. They need some depth there, and they need a guy who can carry the rock, because obviously Ty Johnson and Josh Adams are kind of intriguing. Michael Pirine, we'll see how he fits this new offense, an up and down rookie year. But I think they need a veteran, a guy that can get you 80 rushing yards a game. If you give them the rock. They might also look to add somebody in the draft, but I think that free agent market for the running backs is going to be one that isn't going to be too costly, but you're going to get a good player.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do with Josh Adams, because he's a restricted free agent. But he didn't get a lot of touches last year, but he did a lot with the ones he did get.
Right.
He was extremely efficient. So it will be interesting to see if they bring him back. I think they should.
And he's a good fit for the scheme. I mean, they need guys who can get outside and get upfield, and Adams brings that speed element. That's where I'm a little worried with Pirine, but if every running back brings something different, a guy like Pirine could be more of your in the tackle, short yardage type of running back. But I think Adams is a guy they definitely will look to bring back, at least for training camp, to see how he performs in 2021. But when you look at receiver, Michael, another lesson for Joe Douglas learned is that maybe he shouldn't go cheap on the receivers. Obviously, he went the bargain route with Brashad Perriman, opting not to re-sign Robbie Anderson. He drafted a receiver in the second round, but he didn't really work much in the depth. And clearly it showed throughout the season that a lot of those guys couldn't stay healthy. The depth wasn't good. And even when they all were healthy, they weren't necessarily a good receiving trio for Sam Darnold. Obviously, Jamison Crowder is a great slot receiver. He's not a free agent. I don't think he'll get cut. People have been talking about how you could free up $10 million. I doubt it. I think he's a good fit for this offense, and I think he's one of the Jets' few good offensive players. And obviously, Denzel Mims, who will be a starting receiver for the Jets. Hopefully, we get to see him in a bigger sample size. But Michael, who do you think fits in with this receiver group? What type of receiver do you think Joe Douglas is going to look to add? Do you think he's going to go for the big money Allen Robinson type of receiver? Do you think he's going to go maybe for an underrated guy and then draft somebody in free agency and just kind of build out the unit? I mean, what type of receiver do you think he's going to look for? And then who are some of the guys that you think would be great fits for this Michael LaFleur offense?
Yeah, I look straight to Curtis Samuel. I think he's the guy who has the best blend of having that game-breaking talent, but also being a really good fit for the offense. Because this is an offense, I think you look at the Niners, what they did the past few years, that is more so about getting playmakers in space than it is about featuring one guy and feeding him the ball on the outside. It's more about crossing routes, slants, and also the screen game, things like that, where you're getting guys who can make plays, the ball in good positions to make those plays. And Curtis Samuel is a guy who this past season did it in all sort of ways. He led wide receivers in snaps out of the backfield and rushing yards and rushing attempts and was efficient with them. His yards after contact per carry was really good. He can make plays as a yak guy. He's very good in that area. And he can also make plays deep. He had the best catch rate on deep passes among wide receivers this past season. So huge breakout season this past year. It definitely came out of nowhere to an extent, because the past 3 seasons before that, he didn't do not much of anything, but he never hit 40 yards per game in a season. So he was never close to as productive as he was this past season. So he is a little bit of a one-year wonder, but he's also only 25 years old, which is extremely young for an unrestricted free agent at any position. So he's definitely really interesting in terms of the combination of both fit and having that high level production. But there's also a few, outside wide receivers who might not fit the same mold in terms of Samuel, but guys who are really good and should be able to fit in any offense. So what do you think of some of those top big name guys?
Obviously, I think Curtis Samuel has become a Jets Twitter favorite. You touched on him. The Jets are looking for an explosive yak guy to fit in with the receiving group that they have, and Samuel fits the description. I think Corey Davis is another guy who could really work well in this offense, in a similar offense in Tennessee. I think he would mesh perfectly with Crowder and Mims. The price on a guy like Davis is going to be interesting because, he's had an up and down career, but obviously trending upward. If he's a guy that creeps into the 13, 14, $15 million a year, I could see the Jets backing away and maybe pivoting to a guy like Kendrick Bourne from San Francisco. Obviously has experience in the offense from that. Still a young guy, can bring that yak ability. And maybe they sign a guy like Bourne and then they draft somebody on day 2. And then they kind of just build out the unit that way. They have good depth and they don't really have to worry as much about injuries depleting a unit. I think they'll stay away from Allen Robinson. I just don't think I don't think he makes much sense for what the Jets really need. He's not an explosive yak guy. Obviously, he's an amazing receiver. And if the Jets sign him, I'll be ecstatic, because the one thing we learned is that you just need talent around your quarterback. And look, and we've been talking about Gase not building a system around his players, and hopefully LaFleur will build a system around his players. So if they go after a guy like Robinson, I'm sure that LaFleur and the Jets can figure out a way to get both him and Mims and Crowder involved and diverse in different ways. But I just don't see Joe Douglas shelling out $18 million, $19 million a year to Allen Robinson, to a guy that the Jets don't necessarily need his type of big body possession type of receiver. So I think they'll stay away from that. I just think Joe Douglas in general doesn't believe in giving out $20 million a year free agent contracts. Juju Smith-Schuster and Will Fuller, 2 other guys that I think could maybe get more than necessarily what they're worth. Michael, what are your thoughts on those 2 guys? Because you obviously, and maybe I should have led with this, you've done an article ranking every single position group for free agency, and you're pretty low on a guy like Juju, who actually on the outset would be a good fit for this offense, but there's some concerns about him playing outside and his career is trending downwards the last few years. And then a guy like Fuller is obviously going to bring that explosion, but is that a lot of yak yards or is that more, deep threat 9-ball type of yards? So just what are your thoughts on Schuster and Fuller?
Well, I do think Smith-Schuster is a guy who could get overpaid, just based on, the past production, what he did his first 2 seasons, and also just the name brand part of it. So if he does get, massively overpaid, like he's a top option, that's definitely something you want to stay away from. But if his market fits more to what he's actually done the past 2 seasons, then maybe he could be a good value because he's another guy who, like Curtis Samuel, is really young. He's still only going to be 24 when this season starts. So he's as young as it gets. Actually, among all the positions I ranked, he's one of, I think, the second youngest or the youngest among unrestricted free agents. So that's definitely a plus. So there's still room for him to move forward. But I think his production just hasn't been there the past 2 seasons since Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell left, and he's been basically their top guy. He just hasn't been able to produce in that role. And also he's sort of clashes with Jameson Crowder in the slot, but maybe playing on the outside is a better fit for him. That's sort of where he made a lot of his big plays the first 2 seasons. So that could project well for him. But overall, I think you want to be a little careful with Smith-Schuster because of his dip in production the past 2 seasons. But Will Fuller is interesting because he does not stay on the field. It's definitely something that's been an issue for him. You already know he's going to miss time at the beginning of next season because of his suspension, but he has put up really good numbers. He averaged about 80 receiving yards a game last season. He's one of the top 3 deep threats in the league, maybe top 3 to 5.
Right.
And he just continues to play extremely efficient football every season when he's healthy. So the Jets are looking for a deep threat, and because Denzel Mims can be that type of player, but is he your speed burner guy? That's not really his game. He's a very good outside player. He can win some go balls. He won plenty of them that, some of which didn't get rewarded, but he's not necessarily your, pure speed guy. He's more of a versatile X receiver who can get some curl routes for you. He can get some digs, comebacks, back shoulder throws, things like that. Primarily, obviously he can get some go balls, but that's not his bread and butter. So if you are looking for that guy, Will Fuller is about as good as it gets, and he's done it at a high volume, high efficiency. The guy put up 80 receiving yards per game last year, and he did it efficiently. So I think he's definitely someone who's interesting. The staying on the field is a huge question mark, but when he's on it, he produces very well.
Yeah, I mean, Fuller's interesting. I just think that the Jets are going to do a good job. I think Joe Douglas has shown a good
I don't
job
see him as a
of
Jets signing.
right.
For
That's
sure.
what I was going to say is I think that, one of the things that you touched on is something that Robbie Sabo has been touching on a lot about how the Jets have to have a focus this offseason on adding guys who aren't injury prone. And obviously injuries are something you can't predict. You and I were talking before the show, and you mentioned to me that CJ Mosley was a guy who barely missed a game. He comes to New York and he plays 3 quarters and he's essentially out for 2 years, barring one game against New England where he was playing on one leg. So you can't really predict injuries, but if there's a guy who's consistently missing 5 to 8 games every season, you can pretty much tell that, okay, that's a guy that we're not going to be able to count on all 16 games. And I think it's something like, look, obviously the Jets have struggled with bad talent and bad coaching, but they've also just had bad injury luck. And I think there should be a focus on obviously getting athletic guys, team captains and leaders, but there has to be a focus on getting guys who can stay on the field. And Fuller, I don't necessarily think fits that mold. I do think that Joe Douglas is going to want to build a tough team. And I think he's going to look to find guys who are playing 15, 16 games every season that they've been in the league. So I just don't think he's necessarily a scheme fit. Obviously you can make it work, but this offense is something that's prioritizing short and medium routes, getting yards after catch, and then taking those deep shots. So maybe a guy like Fuller for those type of plays, but if you're going to overpay him, or if you're going to pay him this offseason, I do think he's going to get a lot of money, and I just don't feel like he's worth it in that specialty role, especially when you have all those draft picks that you can use to maybe go out and get a deep threat. But pivoting toward the offensive line, Michael, obviously this is something that Joe Douglas has been talking about since he's got here, is building up the offensive line. I think year one was about what we expected, honestly. I mean, I think Becton was way better than we expected. I think McGovern was a little bit worse than we expected. But overall, we just expected him to take a jump from being absolutely terrible to below average to average. And I think this is the offseason where Douglas can make a below average to average line into a good to very good offensive line. Who are some of the offensive line targets you want the Jets to go after? Obviously, Becton and McGovern are the only guys they're locked into. I don't see the Jets moving Beckham from left tackle to right tackle for any reason. I could see the Jets moving McGovern from center to guard maybe, but essentially every position outside of those two is open season. I mean, obviously George Fant could come back at right tackle, but I don't think they'll discount looking to improve in all avenues. Who are some of your favorite guys at the offensive line spot in free agency?
Yeah, well, let's start with the guards because that's where you have to improve. You have
Right.
Greg Van Roten at one spot who's fine. He started out the season really bad, then he's playing really well, then he struggled and missed some games. So he's a stopgap in the truest sense. But then in the opposite side, you had Alex Lewis, who was not good at all, and then all the backups who came in were terrible. Andrews, Elflein, McDermott played a little bit of guard. That didn't work. Those guys were absolutely terrible. So you have to improve those two guard spots. Whereas you have, Becton, you have McGovern at center, who even though he had his struggles, he's going to be here because of his contract. And George Fant was not nearly as bad as the guards were, although you can improve on him, which we'll talk about. But
I also think that Fant and McGovern are great scheme fits for this offense.
Yeah,
so I think their production could go up.
That is a great point. But with the guards, that's where you have to improve. So when you look at this guard market in free agency, it's not very deep at all. It's probably one of the weakest position groups in free agency. But at the top, you have two superstars. Outside of them, very little else. So those two guys at the top, Brandon Scherf and Joe Thuney, have both been top 5 at their positions. Scherf on the right side and Thuney on the left side. Those two guys have both been top 5 or so guards at their respective positions in pretty much the last 3+ seasons. Scherf his whole career, really. Thuney the last 3 seasons. So those guys are as good as it gets at their positions. And then durability is the interesting differentiator between these two guys, because Thuney's been extremely durable throughout his career. He hasn't missed a single game, but Scherf, on the other hand, has missed quite a few games over the past few seasons. He only played 13 this season, and he hasn't played a full 16-game season since 2016. So that is the key difference between them, but they're both very good. And I think they would both fit in the scheme as well. I think a lot of people see Scherf as more of a mauler sort of guy, but he does have that mobility. He definitely has that. He's an all-around very good player. But outside of those two guys at guard, there's really nothing. There are a couple, Kelechi Osemele's out there, but he's not coming back to the Jets. We know that. Mike Iupati is out there, but he's 34 and he barely plays over half of his games now, although he's pretty decent. But Alex Redmond from the Bengals is a decent starter who's only 26 years old. He's unrestricted, but he only started 7 games last year and doesn't have a lot of starting experience. So maybe he's the only guy worth talking about because he was okay as a run blocker last year, but it's weak. If you don't get Scherf or Thuney, there's nothing to do with the guards in free agency.
I'm fairly confident that the Jets will walk away with Scherf or Thuney. I think the problem when you have a guard market or any position market that's top heavy and not very deep, especially a position like offensive line, where I think a lot of teams are always looking to improve. This shouldn't matter, but in the Super Bowl, you watch Patrick Mahomes with a poor offensive line on a national stage, the biggest stage, and you see how a great player can be affected by that. I know Michael was complaining about this to me earlier, how that should matter. It's just one game, but I think it does matter.
Well, no, all I'm saying is that it's people don't realize it until they see in the Super Bowl. We know offensive line is important. That's all I'm saying, because everyone just collectively realized that offensive line is important because of the Super Bowl, but we know it's important.
I think most NFL teams already knew that, but I do think you're going to see a lot of teams saying, hey, look, this superstar Mahomes, was held to no touchdowns in the Super Bowl because of his offensive line play. Let's go get a one of these big boys in Thuney or Scherf. The Jets have such a need at guard. Joe Douglas is desperately trying to improve this unit. If you have one of these guys, the unit's going to dramatically improve. And there's not many teams that can even pay like the Jets can pay. So I do think the Jets will walk away with one of them. I don't see a situation where they don't get one. I think that would be, I think the problem is that the price tag for them is just going to keep skyrocketing with the bidding war. I think Thuney is target number 1 because of the durability and the scheme fit. If that price tag gets to a point where Joe Douglas is uncomfortable and he can pivot to a guy like Scherf, who is maybe more of a mauler. Obviously he can move, like you mentioned, but he's a little bit older and has the injury concerns. You could probably get him for cheaper and then you can add him. But I think Joe Thuney is absolutely Joe Douglas's top target. From all reports, it sounded like he was his top target last year and they thought they might be able to get him. Then the Patriots tagged him at the last minute. So I think out of anybody on this list, the guy that I'm most confident about the Jets getting is Joe Thuney. But obviously with the Jets, they always find a way to break your heart. So I won't count on it. I do think that the Jets stick with Fant for another year. I actually think he was a great locker room guy. He played all right. He played better than a lot of people thought he would. And I think he's great depth too, because I think you can have him and then maybe you draft a tackle or right tackle in the 4th round or something. And maybe you try to develop him to be your starting right tackle in 2022. And Fant can, turn into a swing tackle. But I think that Fant is really going to be a guy who benefits from the scheme change because of his athleticism and his ability to get out in space. So I think going into the draft, you're looking at an offensive line of Becton, either Tooney or Scherf, McGovern, probably Van Roten. I think he's probably a better fit than Lewis and Fant. And then they're going to look in the draft to add one of those other guards and maybe another tackle.
And let's talk about the tackles and free agency too, because that is a really interesting discussion because they can cut George Fant and clear a pretty decent amount of cap space. I believe around $8 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's on the table. He had a decent season, definitely improved over his Seattle days, but he wasn't great. He was definitely below average for a right tackle. He wasn't as bad as the guards were, but you can get a lot better. And I don't think this would be discussion if these guys weren't on the free agent market, but there are 2 really good right tackles in their prime set to hit the free agent market. Daryl Williams from the Bills and Taylor Moton from the Panthers. And Daryl Williams actually was the right tackle for the Panthers before Taylor Moton. They played alongside each other. So both those guys are top tier right tackles who are above, we're in like the top 10 to 20% among all tackles in most pass blocking and run blocking stats. And they both started all 16 games last year. Moton is 27, Williams is 29. So those are 2 elite right tackles in their prime in the free agent market. So if you're really trying to improve your offensive line and to not be in on one of those guys because you have a not terrible right tackle and Fant, doesn't seem like it fits in with truly being committed to the offensive line. So I think they'll definitely put in offers on these guys, be in the mix, knowing that you can cut ties with Fant pretty comfortably if you do get one of them. But if they don't get one of those top star guys, Moton or Williams, then you can stick with Fant. There are bigger needs on the team. It's probably still a long-term need because unless he improves in the scheme, but these 2 star guys out there, I think they should and will take their shots at them. And if they can get them, you can cut ties with Fant. If not, you can stick with him. That's okay for the time being. And like you said, good scheme fit. There wasn't enough of him kicking out to the second level last season for his athleticism. I think that is definitely something they didn't take advantage of enough. And I think we should see more of this year.
Yeah, they built this really athletic offensive line, but they didn't really get out in space at all. They were just kind of stationary.
Yeah, it was just
blockers.
A lot of inside zone, just like zone step, kick the guy out, and maybe get to the second level a few times. Not a lot of creativity to it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit quick to discount cutting Fant and adding one of these other guys. I just think because he's such a good scheme fit and because he was a team captain last year, and because I think he was okay last year and he's only going to get better and there's so many other holes, I'd be surprised, but you raise a good point. I mean, if you can sign a guy like Moton, who's, let's say you sign him to a $12 million a year contract or something, and you cut Fant, and it's only really a net difference of $4 million a year, maybe that would be worth doing. I just know that typically, I shouldn't say I know this, but typically it seems like Joe Douglas is going to want to build through the draft. It would make sense to maybe draft a guy on late day 2 or early day 3 at that tackle spot to have him develop behind Fant into maybe your start in 2022. But that's a really interesting point you made. Certainly something to keep an eye on. There is really no risk there. I mean, if you sign one of them, you just cut Fant or restructure him. But certainly the guard spot is the priority for that offensive line position group. But when you look at the edge position, and when we get towards the defense, this is where the Jets really need a lot of work in free agency, because free agency is about plugging holes, and the Jets have a lot of them on the defensive side of the football. Let's start with the edge position, Michael. Who are some of your favorite guys here? Obviously, the Jets switching from a 3-4 to a 4-3. Regardless, they need a pass rusher, and specifically now that they're switching to a 4-man front where they're going to be rushing 4, they need that Leo defensive end. I think that one Leo spot. Outside of that, I think Robert Saleh is in good shape on his defensive line between Quinn and Foley and John Franklin Myers. I think he needs that Leo, and then he's going to need somebody behind Franklin Myers, where when Franklin Myers subs inside next to Quinn Williams on passing downs, they need another defensive end there. So the Jets could add 2 edge prospects. Who are some of your favorite fits for this defense?
Yeah, they really need a couple of edge rushers because right now the only guys you have signed are Jabari Zuniga, Kyle Phillips, and Bryce Huff. Three guys who I think are good fits in this scheme, but they're young. They haven't proven much yet. Can't rely on them. So hopefully they can carve out their roles, but you definitely got to improve as much as you can until they prove that they can take those positions. So I think you're right. We could see a couple of additions in free agency to fill starting spots at the edge positions. I think in the draft, they'll definitely be aggressive there, whether it's the second first round pick, the early second, wherever they do it, definitely early in the draft. But there has to be at least one in free agency, I think. And they're lucky enough to have some very good down linemen who sort of fit that scheme, who can play that 5-tech role, rush off the edge with their hands in the dirt, because that's what they need. You need more of a Nick Bosa sort of type rusher, Eric Armstead. Those are the guys who they had out there. Guys who are, at that wide 5-tech, hand in the dirt, rushing from that position, more so than you need like a Von Miller stand-up sort of guy. Those are the guys they need. And there are some good fits who play that sort of way and were very productive last year. Carl Lawson from the Bengals is probably my personal favorite. He is very explosive, a lot of speed and power. Romeo Okwara is a good one. Similarly productive. Both those guys were top 10 in pressures among edge rushers last year. Okwara is a little bit different. He's more of a technician, not very athletic at all, but his technique and hands is really good. Some questions about he's 1-year wonder, and he also had some issues with run defense this year. But pass rushing, those two guys are elite. Trey Hendrickson was second in the league in sacks this year, and he was up there in pressures as well. Kerry Hyder played with the Niners last year, had a breakout season. He's a little up there in age. He's about to be 30, but he was a top pressure guy as well. So all those guys are good fits. And obviously Shaq Barrett's going to be out there. He doesn't fit that mold. He's a stand-up guy. He's good enough to where you find a way to fit him in if you can get him.
Right.
But he doesn't fit that defensive end mold. But in terms of pressure production, he's the best guy in the league right now.
Yeah, he could definitely be that Leo for this defense. He might be standing up. He might have his hand in the dirt a little bit, but they need, with that spot, you want somebody with speed and could get after the pass rusher or can get after the quarterback. And Barrett obviously fits that mold. Who are some of the guys you think they should avoid? Not just obviously scheme fit, but also price tag.
Well, I do want to talk about Okwara a little bit because I like him. The production was there in terms of the pressures, and he is on the younger side. He's only going to be 26, but there are some questions with him, which I did talk about in an article I put up at JetX recently. But his run defense struggled this season. He was a major 1-year wonder, was not nearly as good over his first few seasons compared to this year. So those are question marks. If you have a guy who just breaks out of nowhere, struggles in one phase of the game, and he's also not a great athlete, most of his wins are they're more technique based than explosion. I feel like that could be less sustainable. Maybe it's not. It's just a concern. And like you said, speed's sort of what we're looking for. I don't think he really has that, but it just sort of some question marks with him. But in terms of other guys, and Gawkway is an interesting one because he's as talented as it gets. I think we've seen it from him, but I would just be wary of paying huge money to Gawkway. He did not have a great season this year. Career low pressure rate, only 33rd percentile among edge rushers. Run defense numbers throughout his career aren't good. He also had a down season 2019. So we're talking a couple of seasons now since he's been really elite. So he's definitely trickled down a little bit, but the talent is there, and you still see the big plays and the strip sacks pretty occasionally. So there's a lot of upside with him, but not a guy I would break the bank for. Matt Judon is an interesting all-around player. He can drop back into coverage for you. He's an all-around player, solid against the run, and he's put up good pressure numbers, but he's not really he has a lot of hustle pressures. He puts up numbers, I think, because of they've great coverage there. They've a lot of talent up front on that Baltimore defense, and he sort of benefits a lot from that and puts up numbers with hustle sacks, cleanup sacks, coverage sacks, things like that. So I don't think he's necessarily as good as some of his numbers. Good all-around player, not a guy I would break the bank for to fix my pass rush. So those two Ravens guys, I think, are ones to sort of look out for.
Well, yeah, and Judon's more of a 3-4 outside linebacker
right.
Anyways. Yannick's a guy that is intriguing to me because I do think he's the type of, he's a boom or bust free agent. I certainly am not paying him a boatload of money, but he's one of those guys that, let's say he suffers from what Jadeveon Clowney suffered from last offseason, where a lot of those teams do recognize a lot of the holes that you just pointed out in his game. and let's say he's still around after the first week of free agency, or maybe that is just his market isn't as popular as you might think it would be. If the Jets could get Yannick for a deal that doesn't break the bank, obviously it's going to be a $10 to $15 million deal, but I would be interested. I think he's a guy that in this defense, in that Leo spot, really could shine. And he's certainly shown all the flashes. And if this coaching staff is what we think it might be, I think he's a guy that the Jets could sign, and he could have an explosive season where, people are scratching their heads as to why other teams weren't as interested as the Jets were. But he's also a guy that you could see the Jets signing and him missing every game and not being the pass rusher that we thought he would be and being overrated. So I think he's overrated, I would say, but in some cases he's almost so overrated that he's underrated, if that makes any sense. Yeah. People think that he's so overrated that they underrate him. He's a fantastic player. He consistently flashes elite. Obviously he's a terrific run defender. He's a better pass rusher than people are giving him credit for. I think the consistency is the biggest thing for him. And the question mark of 3 teams in 2 years, I mean, that's certainly concerning. But if the Jets can get him for a deal that's not earth-shattering, I would certainly be interested in it. This edge market is interesting and full of a lot of talent, but there's not many guys that are as talented as Yannick and Gawkway.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's just the point I'm making. He's a couple of years ago, you could definitely justify, absolutely any team would love to sign him to a huge deal as their edge solution. But past couple of years, there's been a little bit too much of a downturn to see him as a surefire solution. But like you said, the talent's there, the big players are there. 4 forced fumbles the past 2 seasons. He gets the sacks. Pressure numbers have just dwindled a little bit too much for me to a below average level, which is important. So I'd just be careful with him. But like you said, if you can get him affordably, he has as much upside as really any edge rusher in the league.
Yeah, and one more guy on edge that we kind of just alluded to, and I think he'd be very under the radar. And I don't think Carl Lawson hits free agency, and let's say the Jets miss out on Okora and Hendrickson and whatever, and they're really looking for that Leo guy. Jadeveon Clowney's still hanging around. Obviously, he's not the player many think he was. He's certainly underwhelmed last year, but I would kick the tires on Jadeveon Clowney. I don't think his value is going to be, his contract's going to be that insane. I think you're going to get him on a cheap deal, probably a short one-term.
I think, like
deal.
you said with Yannick, like Clowney definitely, I think, is a guy who is now at the point where he's so what'd you say? So overrated that he's underrated now.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's
People
sort of the guy
overrated.
he is. Like he had no sacks this year, only 8 games, but no sacks. He had 3 sacks in 2019, but in terms of pressures and run stops, he was still pretty effective this year, well above average.
Yeah,
in both phases. So I think he's a guy who's probably not going to get paid that much now. His value's sort of tanked with the lack of big plays, and also the injuries are important. That's something you want to keep in mind. 3 missed games, 2019, 8 in 2020. But in terms of, you look at this past season, what he did with the Titans in terms of pressures and run stops, and also his grading, he's well above average in every single category, even though he had no sacks. So, and he definitely fits that mold. He's a guy who can really do anything for you. He can stand up out there if you want, or he can play defensive end with his hand in the dirt. So I would look at Clowney if his value goes down because of the sacks.
Yeah, and the Jets already have an elite pass rushing defensive lineman in Quinn Williams, who I think is only going to get better. And I think they're just looking for somebody who can come in and pressure the quarterback, get a few sacks. And a guy like Clowney or Gawkway, if the price tag isn't too much, I mean, they're so athletic and so promising that you're almost willing to take that gamble just to pair him next to Quinn Williams, take some pressure off Quinn, and hopefully the whole unit as a whole will shine. Another guy like Olivia Vernon is kind of an older 1 year, 2 year type of deal that I could see the Jets throwing. I think they just got to add something to their edge talent pool. Obviously, there's so many holes that I don't think they can fully address their pass rushing issues. I mean, it seems like every year it's like they needed a pass rusher and it keeps getting kicked down the road. I think the Jets should start to do some work on it, but I don't think they're going to use an early pick on a pass rusher. So it's sign one of these guys who can start at that Leo spot and draft a guy on day 2 who can be behind John Franklin Myers and then come in as that edge when Franklin Myers slides inside is kind of what I think the Jets are going to do. So yeah, a lot of guys, and obviously a guy like Ronald Blair, or you mentioned Kerry Hyder earlier, guys with solid connections. And I think that's the big thing. You're looking for 49ers connections, because I do think the Jets are going to sign a lot of Niners this offseason. So Kendrick Bourne at the receiver group, Kyle Juszczyk at the fullback group, and then Hyder and Blair, all guys to keep your eye on as far as people who have experience, players who have experience with this coaching staff. Now, this next position is one that I'm actually very intrigued by, and it's that outside linebacker spot. 4-3 outside linebacker. Nobody's talking about this. The Jets need 2 starters here. I mean, the Jets need 2 starting 4-3 outside linebackers to fully run Robert Saleh's defense. So as big of a need as they have at edge, this is a bigger need in my mind. The Jets need to find linebackers to play like next to CJ Mosley, who's a massive question mark in his own right, as far as what type of player he's going to be when he comes back. Michael, who are some of your favorite 4-3 outside linebackers? Because it's very clear when you look at all the needs that on this Jets team, they're going to have to at least sign 1 and maybe sign 2.
Yeah, this is definitely a need that should be talked about more. They're going to need a couple of outside, off-ball linebackers to play next to CJ Mosley. And they don't have any solutions there outside of him on the roster. Hewitt's a free agent, and I don't think he fits anyway in this sort of defense where you really need rangy guys who can cover.
They might bring him back regardless, just to be a backup to Mosley.
Yeah,
even though...
which he doesn't fit. But like you said, he could, be the backup as that Mike inside middle linebacker. But they're going to need some help here. And this isn't a very deep linebacker market, but there are some guys at the top who I think fit the bill pretty well. Jayon Brown from the Titans is a good one. He's got experience in their 4-3 defense. Very good coverage player, consistently puts up really good cover numbers for them. Nicholas Morrow with the Raiders. He's 25 years old, unrestricted free agent. He put up elite coverage numbers in 2020. He played will linebacker in Vegas's 4-3 defense. So those are a couple of guys who were starters last season that fit pretty well. Jayon Brown did have a season-ending injury last year, so that's definitely something that's concerning. Those 2 guys are the 2 starters that I think fit pretty well, but there are some good, more situational players that I think that could be high upside sort of swings that weren't starters last year, but they produced at a level to where they might be able to play well for you. I think Denzel Perryman is an interesting guy. He only played 24 snaps a game for the Chargers last season, which is about a third of the defensive snaps. And he's going to be 29 this year. But when he was out there, he was extremely good, whether it was coverage, run defense, pass rushing. Very, very good in all 3 phases, like top 5% numbers at the top 10% numbers at the position, all 3 of those phases. So he's an interesting guy and also a scheme fit as well. And then there are a couple of veteran guys, Kevin Pierre-Louis, who played with Washington this past season, and then Malcolm Smith with the Browns.
Former Jet from
a couple of years ago, who I actually kind of liked in coverage, and he sort of kept it up the past 2 seasons. Those 2 guys are veterans, but they're guys who can play on passing downs for you and cover a little bit. And a guy I think that you would like to talk a lot about, I know you're a big fan of, is Tyus Bowser. I like him quite a bit.
Definitely. Well, I mean, first of all, we talked about Joe Douglas looking at Philadelphia and Baltimore for trying to build that type of culture. Tyus Bowser, a Baltimore guy, and obviously he didn't overlap with Joe Douglas, but I certainly think that matters. And he's in Baltimore has just so many guys to re-sign on that defensive side of the ball between Gawkway and between Jude and Bowser's the guy that I think could slip through the cracks. He's super high coverage grades. He's pretty much the perfect Sam linebacker, the strong side outside linebacker who can get after the passer, but you can also drop him into coverage. I just think he's perfect for Robert Saleh's defense. And I think he's exactly the type of player that the Jets are looking for. Tough, durable, versatile, and great in coverage. And I mean, this is a massive need. And I think Bowser is one of those guys that they definitely need to make sure that they go after. Devondre Campbell's another guy who was in Atlanta, overlapped with Jeff Ulbrich. He would be more of the just the pure pass coverage outside linebacker. He's a guy that would make sense. But without any free agents, I mean, if the Jets had to roll out a 4-3 defense right now and you're looking at that linebacker group, you're talking about if CJ Mosley hasn't played in 2 years at middle linebacker, probably Blake Cashman at that will spot. And then at that Sam spot, I mean, Bryce Huff, probably Harvey Lange, probably Harvey Lange.
Lange's a free agent too.
Lange's a free agent. Yeah, I think they'll bring back Lange to be depth here, but they just have so many holes around this whole roster. But that outside linebacking spot in particular needs a lot of work. So I think that they will be pretty active in this market. I think they should definitely go after a guy in Bowser, who I think is a long-term starter. And then you go after those other guys like Perriman and maybe Pierre-Louis and try to build up the depth of the unit, because as we've seen with the Jets, injuries have been a big issue for them. And if you do go and sign one of these guys, and he gets hurt, this is a nightmare unit for this team. And to run Robert Saleh's defense, you need fast, athletic pass coverage linebackers, and you need a defensive front that can get after the quarterback. And right now the Jets have question marks at both. I feel a little bit better about that D-line just because I think we only really need one or two guys right now. But that linebacking spot is a big question mark for this unit. And if the Jets defense is not good next year, it's going to be the linebacking unit is the reason why they underperform. Let's take a look at the secondary. Lastly, this is the last position group. We kind of lumped them in corners and safeties because I don't think the Jets will be too active in the safety market, but you never know. There's a few guys we want to talk about. Let's start at cornerback, though. Michael, we've talked about holes that the Jets have. I don't think it's the biggest one, but it's certainly up there. Cornerback is a brutal spot for the Jets right now. I mean, the Jets were given undrafted rookies multiple games of starting experience, so I guess that's good. I think Bryce Hall, who's a 5th-round rookie last year, is probably going to be counted to be a starting outside corner this year because there's nobody really else. I don't think that the Jets can sign 3 outside corners that are going to be better than him, or 3 starting corners that are going to be better than him. Brian Poole's a free agent, the slot corner. They obviously need somebody out opposite Bryce Hall if you are going to start him. And then they just need depth in case Hall doesn't work or guys go down with injuries. I mean, this unit needs a complete makeover. Who are some of the free agents that you think could be a good fit for Rob Saleh's defense?
Yeah, the cornerback market is the thing about the cornerback market is that there are some good options, but there are a lot of catches with the guys who are, who played well last year, because whether there are a lot of older guys who played well last season, there are a lot of restricted free agents, and there's not a ton of guys who check every single box, they're young, they're unrestricted, they played well last year, and they played well the years before that, and they're durable. There are no home runs
That's
here.
pretty much always the case in free agency, though. If somebody hits the market,
well, look,
you get lucky a few times. But
some of these positions, there have been those guys, whether it be the 2 guys at guard. There are a few edge rushers who I think are star sort of guys. Receivers, there are a few.
Right, but that's part of the reason that free agency is a dangerous game, because even if there's an intriguing guy like we're going to talk about in the cornerback group, there's almost always a catch as to why they hit the free agency market. Sometimes you get lucky with a contract dispute or a guy's unhappy, or he just slips through the cracks. But this corner market, like you were just alluding to, is fairly dry.
Right, exactly. And when you look at the list, there are a lot of guys who played well last year, but most of them, whether it's age, durability, being a one-year wonder, being restricted free agent, have some sort of catch to them. But there are a lot of 49ers cornerbacks on. I believe all of their cornerbacks who played at least a decent amount of time last season are free agents, but at least 6 of them are free agents: Emmanuel Mosley, Kwam Williams, Dante Johnson, Richard Sherman, Akella Witherspoon, and Jason Verrett, all free agents. Jason Verrett was really good last year. He's going to be 30. Injuries are obviously a question. 3 games missed last year and countless games the past few seasons before that. But he was elite this past season. He looked exactly like who he was at the beginning of his career. So he's interesting. Richard Sherman is 33. Obviously, I think he would bring a lot in terms of transferring the scheme over and veteran leadership, but he's still pretty good. He's not who he used to be, but in terms of stuff like his passer rating allowed, his yards per cover snap allowed, he was very good last season when he did play, but only 5 games, so it was a small sample. Witherspoon had a good season last year, but it was a little bit of a one-year wonder season, so sort of a question mark with him, because the past few seasons before last year, he wasn't too good. So that's a little bit of a question mark. Kwam Williams in the slot is very good if they want to replace Brian Poole. He's definitely a guy who should be on the table. Only 8 games played this year, so injuries are a question for him too. Again, a lot of these guys have that question mark on this list, but Kwam Williams in the slot, he allowed the fewest yards per cover snap this past season among qualifiers. So he's about as good as it gets. He's definitely elite in the slot. So if the Jets do move on from Poole, who's elite in the slot in his own right and is one of the best corners on the market, probably the best slot corner, then Kwam Williams is a good fallback who also has that experience and the connection to the coaching staff. But plenty of Niners if they're looking for and also I think at cornerback it's good to have that it's a position where any single mistake, any blunder can just absolutely destroy a drive. There aren't really any other positions like that. Like if you're an edge rusher and you mess up, okay, you didn't create pressure in this down, it's not a big deal. If you're a running back and you make a bad cut, okay, you lose a couple yards. But if you're a cornerback and you make one bad mistake in terms of playing your role on defense, you can give up an 80-yard touchdown. So it's a very important position to have familiarity and comfort in the scheme. So this is definitely a position where they could look at one of these 49ers quarterbacks or corners, or maybe even multiple of them, to try and make sure they get this defense molded in, that the transition goes smoothly and you can avoid as many of those coverage busts as you can. So I would certainly expect at least one of these Niners to be starting for the Jets next year. I think Sherman's going to be here. I do feel good about that one. But if not him, there are a lot of other guys who played for Saleh last year who are going to be available.
Yeah, from purely just a gameplay perspective, Richard Sherman makes absolutely no sense for the Jets. I mean, he's a declining veteran who probably wants to play on a championship team, who has been contemplating a move to safety because his play has been declining at corner. But obviously he loves Robert Saleh. Richard Sherman to the Jets isn't necessarily bringing an elite corner. What he's bringing is an elite leader, a guy who knows Robert Saleh's system and can teach it to the younger players. I mean, you're bringing him in more for what he brings off the field, honestly, than he is on the field. I agree with you. I think he will be a Jet, but I think it should be a 1-year deal, maybe 2 years, but it really shouldn't be that much money.
I mean, look, with Sherman, we should expect him to decline. It would be silly not to, but I just think it should be understood. He was good. He was good last year.
He played 5 games.
It was only 5 games. He was good, though. I'm just saying.
Yeah, but I'm sorry. He's 5 games. He's missed multiple seasons due to injury. His career has been declining. I agree that he was great in 2019 and he's still a good corner, but another year after missing the majority 11 games last year, I just don't think you're signing a guy who's going to be a top tier corner. I'm not saying he's awful. Like, I don't think he's going to be 2016 Revis levels of bad, but I think you're signing a guy who's going to be better than Pierre Desir and Lamar Jackson, whoever else we were trotting out there. But you're not getting a long-term starter, obviously, but you're not even really getting a great stopgap either in my mind. I think you're signing him for what he brings off the field, not to throw water on anybody's parade here. I just think that he's not the player that I think a lot of fans think he is when they think, oh, we're signing Richard Sherman. We're not signing 2012 Richard Sherman. We're signing on his way out, back 9 Richard Sherman. I think you mentioned Kwam Williams. I think he's definitely a guy who makes a lot of sense. Poole has his own injury issues, and Williams also has a lot of injury issues, so they kind of offset each other in that regard. So tie goes to Williams, who has a terrific relationship with Robert Saleh. So I would not be surprised to see him in the nickel position. If they don't want to go with either of them, if the injury concerns are too big, maybe they turn around to a guy like Desmond King, who has had some injury issues in his past, but he played 15 games this last year, was a really good nickel corner. They could also go Darqueze Dennard from Atlanta, has obviously experience in Ulbricht's system. So the cornerback market is pretty dry, as you alluded to. I think Sherman makes a lot of sense. I think they will sign him, and they'll probably draft somebody fairly high. So then they have Sherman, Bryce Hall. They'll probably sign a nickel between King, Williams, and Poole. Right now, I'll just say Williams, and they'll draft somebody. So the corner position is not going to be great for the Jets, but I think it'll still be better than last year. The big X factor is a guy, Bryce Hall. I mean, that's the biggest X factor. Can he continue to take steps? Because I think he was very good for what we were expecting last year as a 5th-round rookie, coming off an injury, playing half a season. But can he do what Bless Austin couldn't do? I think a lot of Jets fans were high on Bless Austin at the end of 2019. I think Hall was better at the end of 2020 than Austin was at the end of 2019, but the Jets shuffled Austin into a starting role in 2020, and it didn't look like he was quite ready for it. He seems more like he's a 4th or a 5th string corner. Let's see if Hall can take that step into being, okay, this guy's an absolute starting corner for this team for the next 5 years. Michael, lastly, before we wrap this whole thing up, we've gone through every position. You've written countless articles on free agency. We still have a month to go, but I want your 5 free agents that you think the Jets do end up signing in 2021.
So I do think Richard Sherman is going to be coming here. I feel pretty confident in that one, just because of how highly he's spoken of Saleh. The Jets need, like I said about cornerback and just the secondary in general. I think it's important to have a lot of camaraderie and familiarity there, because it's the one position in the game other than quarterback, but the one position on defense really where you can just lose a drive in one play. So you got to be able to have that transition go smoothly, and having a veteran like Sherman, who's a very good bend but don't break corner, even at this stage of his career, I think can be really instrumental in that. So I think the Jets are going to want him. I think he's going to want Saleh, and I do think that's going to happen. So I'll go with Richard Sherman. I think Joe Tooney's going to come. I do think as long as the Patriots aren't too aggressive trying to get him back, I think the Jets are going to go all out for him and sign him. Then those are two guys I feel good about. They come to mind right away, but three more in addition to that. I think at running back, I like Jamal Williams as a signing. I think he fits what they're going to want to do in terms of the running back position, not necessarily looking for a bell cow guy, but getting a good committee in there, a lot of different skills. You already have Ty Johnson and P. Ryan to add Jamal Williams. I think gives you a nice, versatile little stable to work with to go into the season. So I'll put him in there also. I think I'm going to go with Curtis Samuel. I am going to go with Curtis Samuel. I think he fits what they need on the offense. I think that's the prototype sort of signing where you're getting talent and you're, getting big name talent, but also sort of fitting, getting what your coaches need to run their scheme. I think he's a good combination of those two things. And then at edge, I'm going to go with Tyus Bowser. I do think, or edge / linebacker, more so linebacker. I think he's probably playing Will or Sam for you, 4-3 next to Mosley.
He's playing Sam.
So I'm going to go with Bowser as well. Sort of has that Ravens connection to Douglas. Obviously, Douglas hasn't been with the Ravens for quite a while, but still, just having that connection is definitely something that sort of gives him more familiarity, I think. So I think that would be my five of guys who I think they're likely to sign: Curtis Samuel, Jamal Williams, Joe Thuney, Tyus Bowser, and Richard Sherman.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of guys there that I do think the Jets will sign. Jamal Williams makes a ton of sense to this team. I think he's probably a signing. Richard Sherman, we've obviously covered why. I think he will also be a signing. But I'm going to leave those two guys off my five, try to mix it up a little bit. But I'm going to keep two guys that you mentioned, Joe Thuney, number one, and Tyus Bowser, number two. With Thuney, I just think that he is going to hit free agency. I just think the Jets are going to go all out. They have a massive need there. They can outbid anybody. I just think it makes a lot of sense for the Jets. And you add him to that offensive line, the Jets get so much better. I mean, their offensive line gets so much better with a really good elite guard next to Becton and in between Becton and McGovern. I think it makes so much sense. And what it will, I think that signing alone will have more impact on this team than pretty much any other signing. I just think he's that good of a player. And then with Bowser, yeah, I think he's the perfect Sam linebacker for Robert Saleh. You can rush the passer with him. He's elite in coverage. They need a 4-3 outside linebacker, obviously the Baltimore connection. I just think that he makes all the sense in the world for the Jets. And I don't think he's going to be that expensive. I mean, he's going to get paid nicely, but I don't think he's going to be a crazy expensive linebacker. But the three, I'll mix it up. First, Kyle Juszczyk. I think we talked about him at the beginning of this podcast. I just think that the Jets need a fullback. Obviously, he's not just any fullback. I do think he will get around $5 million a year, and I think he's worth it. You're getting an extra offensive lineman and an extra tight end and an extra running back in one player. He knows the system. I think he's one of the smarter guys in the NFL, so I think he can help teach the rest of the players the system. I just think he makes a lot of sense for Mike LaFleur's offense if he doesn't go back to San Francisco. Kendrick Bourne is the other guy that I think the Jets will end up signing, my fourth guy. I think they're going to be in on Curtis Samuel. I just think that a lot of the league is going to be in on Curtis Samuel. A lot of teams are running more of this West Coast Shanahan type of system, and a lot of teams want explosive yak guys. And I just think Samuel's price tag is just going to keep inflating to the point where he's getting way overpaid. And that's just what happens in free agency is good players get played like great players. And I think Samuel's a very good player. I think it's the system. He'd be a great player. But I just don't see Douglas approaching $15, $16, $17 million a year with him. And I just think that Samuel could attract that type of contract. So in the end, I don't think they get him. I think they'll definitely be in on him. And if the money's right, he'll be a Jet. But Kendrick Bourne is a nice plan B, I think, or maybe even a plan C. I think he just fits the system. You're buying him when his stock is relatively low. He's only 26, but he's played in the system. He's flashed a lot. I think he can be a starting outside receiver. And I think you sign him and then you go ahead and you draft somebody day two. And you have a nice 4-person wide receiver trio right there, or quartet, I guess, of good talent on the outside for your quarterback. And then lastly, I'll go with Kwam Williams, the slot guy. I just think that his relationship with Saleh makes too much sense. They both love each other. I think that the Jets need a nickel corner. It's a toss-up between him and Poole. Both are great players that have suffered injuries the last few seasons, but I think Ty goes to the guy who was experienced in in Robert Saleh's system. So you're looking at a very 49ers influenced secondary with Kwam Williams and Richard Sherman, but end of the day, I think that the Jets are going to be fairly active in free agency. I think they will go to some of those routes in San Francisco, Atlanta, and Philly and Baltimore, whatever the front office and coaching staff has roots at. But I think ultimately the Jets are going to walk away with a nice sum of players. I don't think they're going to break the bank for any one player outside of Tooney, but I think outside of that, they're going to get a lot of those second tier guys. I think the Jets can be fairly active, and I think Douglas is just going to have to be aggressive because this team desperately needs to be improved. They have a lot to turn around. It's a new coaching staff. I just don't think there's any excuses. I think the Jets are going to go after Tooney as their one big player and then focus on building up the rest of the roster and then building through the draft. But certainly you can build through the draft and still be aggressive in free agency. And I think that is what Joe Douglas ultimately will do. All right, that's going to wrap up our 2021 free agency primer for the New York Jets. Mike, always a pleasure sitting down and doing a podcast with you. Next week, special guest Oscar Aparicio will be joining us again. You might know him from our Rob Saleh podcast. He came on before the Jets had hired Saleh and really sold us on why he was the best candidate for the Jets. He's going to come back on. We're going to talk about his staff, break him down a little bit more in depth. So keep a lookout for that next week. As always, you can follow us at CYJ Pod on Twitter. You can follow Michael at Michael_Nania, myself at Ben W. Blessington. Find us at jetsxfactor.com, the best place to go for Jets content. A lot of stuff is coming out of Jets X Factor this offseason, specifically the next 2 months with free agency and the draft. So stay tuned there. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Michael, any last words?
Yeah, just check out all the free agent stuff that I've been doing at Jets X Factor. I've done a ton of stuff on free agency already, and we'll continue to be doing it over the next month plus as free agency begins to arrive. I've already ranked all the qualified free agents at every position of need for the Jets. I'm starting to do profiles on some of the top guys, all of their specific strengths and weaknesses, and looking at them both in terms of numbers and film. I've already done Carl Lawson and Romeo Okora. Should be doing a lot more over the next few weeks. So check out all that free agency stuff at Jets X Factor. And I can't wait to talk to Oscar again next week because he was my favorite guest of all of the. No offense to everyone.
Yeah, geez,
not that we have, not that we have a ranking or anything, but he was my favorite. So it was definitely cool that they ended up hiring Saleh. So then we could look back on that podcast and re-listen to it. So it'll be great to have him on again, and we'll be releasing our full ranking of all the guests next podcast. I'm just kidding.
The 2021 season is officially underway with the ending of the Super Bowl, so stay tuned with us. A lot of good content coming your way. And as always, folks, don't let the Jets ruin your life.
To the end zone, touchdown. Hunter the beat, and the punter brings him down. Braden Mann saved a touchdown, most likely.
Looks right, fires a bomb down the right sideline again for Mims. What a catch by Denzel Mims.